So to set things up right, in Florida we had what the government labeled the Seminole or Indian Wars. These wars were fought over a number of years between 1816 and 1858. Of course, these two wars were fought to take over the remaining lands of Florida. Even after the war, the Indians still fought. It's important to know this because the story takes place right in the heart of where some crucial battles took place. See, just 3 years after the resting of arms, a band of settlers who were capitalizing on the abundance of newly acquired land, decided to go ahead and expand into their own city. So fast forward 44 years to the summer of 1905 in Socrum, Florida. The city of Munville, about 3 miles south, is booming. They had a railroad, the post office for the town was established and running. Now Socrum is a part of Munville, but in the early years of the county some towns were still being incorporated. One of the main families in that area was the Pra family. Walton and Olivia Pra, their 17-year-old daughter Carol and 14-year-old son Walton Jr. The Pra family owned a citrus farm. Walton also had this wooden bus-type carriage that he built that was pulled by horses, that on the side he would use to make stops around the area and give people rides south into town. Junior would normally take these trips with his father, gaining little tips on the side, helping passengers and whatnot. But his main job, like back at home, was to keep up with the horses while parked in town and along the different stops. So one evening after a trip into town, Junior and Walton were finishing up their normal routines when Olivia called Walton in the main house in need of something important, which made Walton take off abruptly. Knowing Junior was good with the rest of the tasks, he left him to finish up. Now on their farm they had a pretty good-sized lake, which they called Indian Lake. So you have the main house in the center of the grove, 80 yards to the right is the barn and stables, and about 150-odd yards directly behind the barn through some swamp grass and a few orange trees is the lake. Junior grew up hearing a number of stories about that lake and the general area, mostly from his mother, who wasn't born but raised from 5 in that area, her father being one of the first settlers. Most of the stories were about how they used the lake to cool off barrels of rum and hide them from the natives who would raid and steal them. But she also told him real stories of fights and brutality with the Indians who still resided in the green swamp just a few miles northeast of where they lived. So to say lightly, Olivia wasn't too kind to them playing around the area by the lake. Well, as Junior was locking up heading back to the house, he remembered something he needed and went back to the barn. He heard the bush under the tree by the barn rustle like someone was crouching in them, but he paid it no attention, grabbed what he needed and headed back into the house. The next morning at breakfast, Junior and Walton were talking about their routes for the day when Olivia comes in bothered and asked why the barn was open. Walton thought for a second and thought maybe when Olivia called him last night he mistakenly left it open. But Junior chimed in and insisted that he locked up last night. Olivia said no, the barn was open, like they didn't even bother. So Junior runs out real quick, takes a look in the barn, everything seemed fine, but at the same time he was pushing the barn door shut he noticed off to the right of the barn a small sack just smaller than the orange sacks the workers used for picking. It caught his attention, but he didn't bother to look into it. Later on in the day, Walton and Junior got everything ready to head out to take their routes into town. As they were heading up the road, Walton asked Junior about the barn being open earlier. Junior told him everything seemed okay and normal. He can't explain how the barn was open, but everything was good. They complete their day. Due to a couple of late passengers, they were later than usual, so Walton stayed in with Junior to help close up for the night. In the middle of putting the final touches of locking up, Walton noticed the same sack Junior saw earlier. Junior noticed his dad going to pick up the bag, and as he was mentioning that he saw it earlier, Walton strangely and frustratingly walked away looking flustered. Walton called for Junior to close the barn good and come in the house now. Junior tried asking his dad what was the matter, but Walton just replied, "Go wash up to eat." At the table that night, Junior and Carol realized the tension and weirdness. It was quite an awkward, but they wrapped up. Carol and Olivia cleaned up and that was that. So he thought. Around 2:45 in the morning, Junior gets up to use the outhouse, which is immediately out the back door to the right of the back stoops when he hears talking on the other side of the back house. He quickly realized that it was his dad, Walton, but who he was talking to he couldn't make out. He stood quietly but tried to get a little closer because curiosity was silently killing him. As he made his way closer, he could make out what his father was saying. Junior heard his father aggressively but yet whispering that he wasn't ready to pay, and this shit is getting outrageous. Now, Junior, feeling compelled to get even closer, leaned too far on the screen door and the latch swung down, creating a noise just loud enough to catch Walton's attention outside. Walton sprung forward towards the door, opening it to find Junior on the other side. Acting normal, Junior plays it off, goes to use the outhouse and came back in. When Junior comes back in, Walton is standing in the kitchen. With a wired look about him, he gingerly asked Junior did he hear anything outside. Junior paused. No, he said. Walton just okayed and the both went to bed. Next morning, when Junior was walking downstairs to breakfast, Carol stopped him at the top of the stairs. Carol asked Junior if he had heard anyone talking last night. Junior remembered that Carol's room was above and to the right of the back house. Junior quickly grabbed her into his room and told her everything of last night. Carol, with a ghostly look, asked Junior if Mother ever told him about her childhood. Junior told her about a few things he knew, some fiction, some non. Carol, realizing that Junior was clueless, so she just okayed him and they went on to breakfast. At the table, Walton told Junior that he would be working the farm that day. That normally meant Junior had an off day. After breakfast, Junior felt he had to get to the bottom of all the weirdness of the past couple of days. He approached his mom in the back, hanging clothes. He asked her about Dad acting weird and told her everything from when he heard the rustling in the trees, to the sack he found, and how he felt something of that sack was contributing to the weirdness of Dad. The whole time Junior was talking, Olivia never stopped what she was doing and told Junior that maybe he was looking into all that too hard. Junior felt frustrated at the tone of response from his mom, so he left. Later that day, Carol came to Junior's room and told him to come on. Let's take a walk. She wanted to show him something. They went off towards the back of the property, towards where the lake was. Carol went on to tell Junior a story that Olivia, their mother, told her one time. But before she started, she asked Junior if he had told her everything he noticed weird. He shrugged and told her yeah, pretty much. They approached the small clearing where the swampy grass goes to a hill and into Indian Lake. Carol looks at Junior and then points to a spot on the lake, asking if Mother ever told him the stories of her childhood and how Grandpa and his friends used to hide rum. Junior assured Carol he had heard every story. As soon as Carol went to resume talking, a loud crack from a branch came from directly behind them. Before Junior could react and turn around, he felt a hard thump on the back of his head and he was knocked unconscious. When Junior came to, he immediately got up and looked around for Carol and he saw nothing. He took off running towards the barn through the grove. While running, he heard his father's voice calling for him and Carol. Junior comes yelling out of the groves and Walton runs over asking, "Is everything okay? Where were you? Where is Carol?" Quickly and clearly as he can, he tells how they took a walk and how he was just standing there when he heard the noise and got hit in the head and now he's here. Olivia immediately goes crazy. She starts yelling, "I knew it," and how she told them not to go down to the lake. Walton runs into the house. Junior immediately comes back at his mom and says, "Wait. Carol was about to tell me something." Walton comes running out of the house with his shotgun and also the sack from earlier. Junior takes off running after his dad, but Olivia tried to stop him. Of course he blows by her, but by the time Junior reached the tree line, Walton was in full sprint and far ahead. At this point Junior is mixed with madness and confusion as he makes his way through the groves, but by the time he had reached the Lakes Walton, his dad was nowhere in sight. He yelled and looked but nothing. He remembered where his sister was pointing and thought to run down there. He changed his mind and went back to the house. Olivia meet Junior on the porch. Junior, as calm as he could with his head still pounding in pain, asked his mom what was going on. Why aren't we calling the authorities or something? Olivia told Junior that she would explain everything later and now their main priority is to wait on his dad to come back. Junior frustratingly asked his mom where did dad go. Olivia finally stopped acting weird for a minute but only told Junior that some of the stories that she had told him were true. Olivia hesitated and with a deep breath said that the only thing is the stories weren't just about the locals and past people but about his grandparents and his uncles. Junior was attentively listening at this point because he couldn't think of any story that connected to this situation. Olivia continued with something that would shake Junior's world. Olivia explained, back when she was about 8 years old her father and uncle used to go hunting. And on this particular hunting trip they went just a little too far north. They knew about the rules of the reservation but they had no luck the whole trip and were getting pretty desperate. So they kept going past Green Pond a little ways when they spotted some game. As they set up to take their shot they were approached from their left by 3 Indians. 2 carrying rifles and 1 just a bow and arrow. They immediately pointed their weapons at each other with her father putting one hand up as to try and say no harm, but the 3 Indians in their half-English were telling them to leave or be killed. With that being said they immediately turned around and hightailed it back down the trail they had just followed and back into their respective territory. But what they didn't know was that one of the Indians followed them back to see where they were going. As her father and uncle passed around the west side of the lake her uncle heard a loud crack behind them and immediately opened fire, and when he looked down it was the Indian with the bow and arrows that lost his footing on a root and fell over. And sure enough he was hit. They went over to check him and of course he was dead. Olivia sighed as she told Junior that when they looked back about 8 yards away was their small sack of supplies that they brought with them, and quickly they both realized that he was just trying to return what they left at the spot they set up in. Well, instead of doing the right thing her father and uncle decided to hide it. And, of course the same way they cooled the rum in the lake they decided to, and that's when Junior decided to end the story. Junior had enough, he couldn't bear to hear any more. But Olivia continued and told him that the sack he found in the barn was the same exact one that her father and uncle used that day, the same one that the Indian was bringing back to them. With a ghostly look on his face Junior went to ask, well, how did they? But Olivia cut him off and said that, yes, they put the sack in the barrel at the bottom of the lake. Junior walks off and sits on the porch sick with the information and confused on this whole ordeal when Walton comes back. He had been gone for almost 2 hours and also didn't have Carol with him. Junior immediately rushed his dad with a load of questions, but Walton just stormed by and went in the house, and Walton and Olivia started arguing until the point they were shouting at each other. Junior just sat on the porch until Walton came out of the front door and asked Junior the same questions from earlier. And Junior reassured him that he didn't see anything or anyone, he just remembered getting up and running home. Now at this point the neighbors from the other farms and surrounding area formed a search party and for the next 5 hours would search everywhere in that area with no luck due to it being nighttime and completely dark. So they decided to call it a night and regroup in the morning. All night long Junior was trying to put everything together in his head and nothing would make sense to him. He got up and walked around his room when he heard someone downstairs. He went down to see Walton sitting on the couch with his rifle and a cup of whiskey sobbing into his hands, so he decided to just leave him be. The following morning, as soon as the sun was up, everybody including the authorities were there and ready to continue the search. The search went on well into the afternoon when one of the officers came up to the house and wanted to talk to Walton and Olivia. Officer Paul started questioning Olivia. He asked her about the history of the property and the lake, how long they have been in the area. Olivia and Walton answered every question to the best of the ability, and that's when Officer Paul asked, "Are you able to handle the fact that your daughter may have been kidnapped or possibly dead?" And that's when Walton asked for the officer to leave. About 30 minutes later, a loud knocking startled everybody in the house towards the door. When they opened, it was 3 officers, Officer Paul and 2 other officers, along with a dozen other people from the search party, standing out in the yard, all with sad looks and crying faces. The officers removed their hats and informed them that they had found Carol. But unfortunately she was dead. Walton, Olivia, and Junior were crushed by it. But Officer Paul spoke up and told them the gruesome details of where she was found. See earlier, when Officer Paul was asking about the history of the property in the lake, he already knew about the rum barrels, and when he came up to talk to them earlier, they were just about to search around and in the lake. Right on the south end of the lake was a plank with an anchor on it about 5 feet in, and attached to it was a 15-foot rope, and when they pulled it in, on the other side of it was an old-style rum barrel. Carol was dead inside.